much. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Alexis Lanzalotta, to discuss the research that she's been doing on hidden communities. So thank you, Alexis, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren, and well, everybody for having me here to talk about this piece, which I believe when the existing conditions reports are inventory and assessments are made public, the hidden communities report is a part of that as well. And so you'll get to see it at that time. But I just wanted to give you some background about what to expect in that section of the plan and kind of where we're hoping to go from what we've done so far. So with that said, I am just going to share my screen with you. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So again, as Lauren mentioned, there's this kind of set aside report that's part of the long range plan, but is meant to be tied to it and but can also kind of stand alone as a report. And it is on Longmeadow's hidden communities. So I want to give you a little bit of background information and talk about the process that that helped feed into this report. So first of all, what you see on the left may be familiar to you from Lauren explaining what the long range plan will consist of. So as Lauren talked about, the different elements that are required by statute, and then Longmeadow's attempt to add these overarching frameworks of climate resilience and social equity. And the hidden communities analysis really pairs with the social equity piece. And I want to give a little background about where this came from. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic, the town of Longmeadow's emergency management department recognized a need to improve communication channels with Longmeadow's hidden communities, particularly to make necessary measures such as contact tracing more doable. And so these hidden communities at that time were kind of primarily defined as non-resident populations who may work in Longmeadow, who may visit Longmeadow regularly, or who may access goods and services in Longmeadow. And then, so just navigating this unprecedented public health emergency really brought this need to improve communications to light. And that also really kind of ties into the climate resilience piece, because for any issue relating to public health, public safety, the town felt strongly, we need to identify these communities that may not be receiving regular municipal communications, but would benefit, and the community at large would benefit from us improving these connections. So the town decided to include an analysis of these hidden communities as part of the scope for the long range plan. And so what we did, we treated this very similarly to any of the other inventory and assessment reports, say, for example, on housing or land use, economic development. It's a mix of quantitative analysis from sources such as the Decennial Census, American Community Survey, and other kind of, well-known demographic resources, but then also interviews with area service providers and municipal staff to get that qualitative input, which really is crucial, especially for learning about hidden communities, because as the name implies, it's kind of hard to get that quantitative information about some of these groups. So the way the report is organized when you are reviewing it, we focused on primarily on Longmeadow's employment base, because that was the first kind of primary identified hidden community, those who are working in Longmeadow, who may or may not live in Longmeadow, but largely do not. Educational institutions. So for purposes of tonight's presentation, just to be brief, I focused primarily on the Longmeadow Public Schools, but you also have Bay Path University and some other special schools as well. So and those are talked about in the report. So then we also looked at the non-resident use of facilities and services. And then we kind of added a bit of narrative about resident hidden communities. So those actually are Longmeadow residents who may kind of fly under the radar, because often this kind of ties in with more vulnerable populations. So we'll talk about, who we heard from primarily municipal staff or service providers as to who these kind of more vulnerable residents are within your community. So that's how we approached the task and the research portion of it. So first, I'm going to talk about Longmeadow's employment base. And so that term, it really means your jobs that are in Longmeadow. And so one thing we looked at just to kind of get a sense of, who might be working in your community is what are the top business establishments in terms of the number of employees. And so the state puts out this information by employee count. I mean, it's grouped in very large numbers, like, over 500 employees, 100 to 500. So it doesn't give an exact count, but it gives these large brackets. And so the largest employers within Longmeadow are assisted living and senior care establishments such as JGS Life Care, Glen Meadow, and that was a large piece of what made this awareness for the emergency management department that communication needed to improve, because you have these very vulnerable populations in these congregate settings. You also have a couple of realtors who are among your largest employers, Longmeadow Public Schools, and then other educational institutions as well, such as the Willie Ross School for the Deaf and Bay Path University, and then the town of Longmeadow. So those are the kind of the top 5 categories of largest employers within the community. And so that kind of is mirrored in the local leading industries. So healthcare and social assistance jobs represent 32% of the jobs based in Longmeadow. And then educational services, a little bit less, as 27% of local jobs. So what's really noteworthy about that healthcare and social assistance, those jobs, while that's one of the biggest industries in your town, it also produces some of the lowest average weekly wages in Longmeadow. So roughly $644 in weekly wages compared to around $1,100 for all wage and salary jobs within your community. So we also looked at the top municipalities in which Longmeadow workers live. And before I'm happy, Lauren and Corinne, to take direction from you on if I should pause and answer questions, or if you want to wait. I see a hand.
I think that it might make sense to pause and answer questions as we go, if that's helpful to you, or we can take them at the end. I'm not sure how many slides you have contained in your presentation.
Yeah, so it's about 20, I believe, and that's fine. Okay, so I'll let
Shelley, do you want to pop in with your question?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, is this data including residents who live in Longmeadow but work outside of Longmeadow?
That's a really great question. So this data right here, and I'll try to be more careful in explaining which population is what. These are jobs based in Longmeadow, meaning non-residents may be commuting to Longmeadow to work in these positions. You may have residents working in them as well. I will talk about, in fact, a lot of the data in this presentation and in the report compares those two populations, those who live in Longmeadow, who may be working elsewhere, and those who work in Longmeadow. And there is, of course, an overlap. It's actually not huge for Longmeadow. But so I'll clarify when the data is talking about those jobs that are actually based in Longmeadow that may or may not be filled by residents versus residents who may be going elsewhere. So to answer your question, these are jobs within your community, and they may or may not be filled by Longmeadow residents, but largely by people from outside Longmeadow.
Right. So employers based in Longmeadow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All
Yep.
right.
I know it is so confusing to talk about, and you'll see on some of my subsequent slides, I really try to distinguish like people who live in Longmeadow versus people who work in Longmeadow. Yes, there's an overlap, but here's where the data differs.
Yeah, I think we talked about it clearly. It's not too confusing, but yeah, so that's why I just wanted to clarify.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So this source called On the Map, which is also from the Census Bureau, gives some insight into where the top municipalities in which Longmeadow workers live. So these are people who work in your community. So over 20% are estimated to be commuting from Springfield, 13% within Longmeadow, and then the third highest is actually coming from Enfield, Connecticut. So the limitation to this data is On the Map does not include those who are self-employed. So your population who lives and works in Longmeadow, if you include self-employed, may actually be higher, but that's just a limitation of this data. I believe they're working on some way for the On the Map software to account for self-employed individuals, but currently it does not. So that's just a limitation here. But we really wanted to look at this because, as was pointed out in the grant application for this process, there's a lot of overlap with where people are coming from to work in Longmeadow, and communities that may have, either lower income or greater percentage of limited English proficiency population and things like that. And one of the ways that's measured is through environmental justice communities. And so this map, you'll be able to see it bigger in the report. I know there's a lot of colors there, just kind of showing the different ways a community can receive this designation. But this comes from a federal program that then states kind of define their own way of designating these environmental justice communities. And it's so states develop their own environmental justice kind of policy. And so for Massachusetts, the way Massachusetts currently defines these environmental justice block groups, it needs to meet one of these criteria. So if there's a block group where the annual median income is no more than 65% of the state's annual median income, and that's for households, that census block is designated an environmental justice population. If there is a census block where 40% or more of the population belongs to a racial or ethnic minority, that also receives an environmental justice community designation. Census blocks where there's 25% or more of households lacking English language proficiency would receive an environmental justice community designation. And then there's kind of another allowance for communities that maybe have slightly lower percentage of minority population, but the municipality's income is not significantly higher than the state. So that's this last one, where 25% of the population in that block group belongs to a racial or ethnic minority, and the municipality's area median income is no greater than 150% of the state's. So even though that's just 4 criteria, you can see there's all these colors over here. That's because, and I can't seem to zoom in while I'm in presenter mode, but just to clarify why there are more than 4 colors is because there are some census block groups that receive multiple designations. So for example, there's this kind of lighter blue color, and that's for census blocks that are both minority, meet the minority criteria and English isolation. The maroon color census blocks are ones that meet minority, income, and English isolation. So like they kind of really clarify if a census block is meeting multiple criteria. Connecticut does it a little bit differently, and this was important for us to look at because that's the municipality, the 3rd highest where people are commuting from to work in Longmeadow. So we wanted to see how Connecticut does it. And in Connecticut, it's a little bit different. For Connecticut, it's if there's a census block group simply where 30% of the population lives below 200% of the federal poverty level. So Enfield, Connecticut, this cluster of census block groups, that they meet that criteria. And you'll see in a moment, that's where a lot of those Enfield commuters are coming from, those block groups. In Connecticut, it can also be what's called a distressed municipality, which I won't go into a ton of detail about how that's ranked, but basically every year the state ranks all of its cities and towns, and according to factors like income, poverty level, things like that. And the top 25 towns who are struggling the most by those factors are considered distressed communities. Now, Enfield is no longer a distressed community, but up until recently it was for several years. So, so that's kind of one of the things we looked at. And then we also looked at where the census block groups that people are commuting from to come work in Longmeadow. So these darker maroon colors, that's a higher concentration based on like persons per square mile. And that's the census block group in which they live, where they commute from to get to Longmeadow. And so these darker maroon colors, they're higher concentration. So there's obviously a big concentration in Longmeadow because that's where you have the 2nd highest number of your employees coming from. But if you look at these 2 maps side by side, you can see a lot of overlap. So for example, in Enfield, that darker concentration there, that means more of the Enfield residents who are commuting to Longmeadow are coming from those areas where they're considered environmental justice communities. Same with Westfield. So in Westfield, this kind of darker, let me see if I can put on a little, there we go. This kind of, can you see that red laser?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that darker pocket corresponds with some census block groups as well that are environmental justice populations. So in Longmeadow, there are no EJ populations, same with East Longmeadow, but it is, you know, pretty clear that people coming into Longmeadow to work may be coming from these environmental justice block groups. And you'll see evidence of that when we look further at kind of what are the demographic profile of the people who work in your community. So another thing that we looked at was citizenship status and language spoken. So I want to just point out here, whenever you see this working population age 16 plus, that's really important because the way the American Community Survey data is broken down, it's just important to recognize this is not looking at the total population of Longmeadow or the total population who works in Longmeadow. It's just looking at the employed population. So what that means, it's not counting retirees, it's not counting people who are unemployed, it's not counting, you know, the youth population. It's just looking at, because we wanted to compare apples to apples, data for those who work in Longmeadow and data for Longmeadow residents who are employed. So that's why that just understand that criteria is limited to the working population. But if you look at those who work in Longmeadow, there's actually a higher percentage of native US citizens. So for 2021, it was closer to 90% than for those who live in Longmeadow. So that may not be surprising to you, especially because, you know, during engagement interviews, we did hear that there are increased populations of people coming to live in Longmeadow who are coming from out of the country. But what I thought was interesting, so even though those who live in Longmeadow are there's a higher instance of coming from outside of the US, they're more likely to have achieved citizenship status. So if you look at the foreign-born US citizen, for those who live in Longmeadow, that's 13%. Whereas when you look at those working in Longmeadow, it's a different breakdown. So if you live in Longmeadow and are part of the working population, you're more likely to be coming from overseas, but also more likely to have achieved citizenship status. And that's really important for communication and, you know, building trust with people who may be in your community regularly. So we also wanted to look at language, and this is still looking at that the working population, so those who are 16 plus. And so for those who work in Longmeadow, there's 83% speak only English compared to 87% for those who live in Longmeadow. So, you know, not too different. But one of the things that was interesting for the Spanish speaking population, the percentage that has limited English proficiency among people working in Longmeadow is much higher, almost a third of those who work in Longmeadow and speak Spanish have limited English proficiency compared to less than 1% for people living in Longmeadow. So again, that's important to consider for communication. And then for other languages, those who speak English very well versus less than very well. Again, you know, a pretty deep difference between the working population in Longmeadow versus the resident working population. One thing to keep in mind, I know some of these numbers seem huge, like a third speaking English less than very well, but keep in mind that's already of a very small amount. So that percentage right here is of those who speak Spanish, which is 4.5%. So it's just, you know, just something to keep in mind.
Alexis, what is the overall number of folks working in Longmeadow?
Oh, good question. I mean, it's in the thousands. I think the jobs that are, I deleted this slide, the jobs that are in Longmeadow, again, not including self-employed, is over 4,000. And then, but again, that data source is not looking at self-employed. So I want to say it was like, I don't know, 4,100 or so jobs that make up those leading industries. And the source that gives us the job count, unfortunately, does not tell us if they live in Longmeadow or not. So, you know, there's going to be some kind of overlap there. Yeah, so an estimated 4,291 jobs in 2021. We also looked at the race of the employed population. And again, it's important to remember this is not looking at your retirees. And we heard there's actually quite a bit, there's some increase in, we heard in one of the retirement communities, population, Asian populations. So that's not going to be represented here because this data source just looks at the working population. But for both those who work in Longmeadow and live in Longmeadow, it's predominantly white, not a surprise. But for those working in Longmeadow, the second most represented racial group is Black or African American at 10%. When you go over to those living in Longmeadow, it shifts and the Asian population represents 7% and the Black community shrinks significantly. So that just kind of shift once you get outside of the, white population, who's represented in those who work in Longmeadow versus those who live in Longmeadow. We also looked at the leading occupations. This is different than industry. So industry is, for example, healthcare and social services, but your occupation is the type of job that you may have in those industries. So this teal color are those who work in Longmeadow. And again, this is that working population 16 plus. And then the orange is those who live in Longmeadow and are working potentially somewhere else. So those who live in Longmeadow are much more likely to be in a management, business, science, and art occupation than those who are working in Longmeadow. And the reason that's significant is for Longmeadow, the wages for management occupations, the median earnings is close to $100,000 annually. And so you have a greater percentage of your resident population working in those occupations than there are jobs within Longmeadow. For those working in Longmeadow, it shifts and there's a higher percentage working in service occupations, and those have the lowest wages in both in Longmeadow, Hampton County, Massachusetts. I mean, that's pretty universal. So that kind of corresponds to this difference in discrepancies in earnings. So again, the blue is the working in Longmeadow. This is over a 10-year period at 5-year intervals. So for 2021, the most recent year we looked at, there's a difference of, it's almost double of what the median earnings are for those who live in Longmeadow versus those working in Longmeadow. And so because of that, you have those working in Longmeadow are more likely to be living in poverty. So these are, again, across a 10-year period, somewhere between, 6 to 6.7% of those working in Longmeadow are living in poverty compared to those living in Longmeadow. So that's it for the employment base. I know that is a lot of information, and I don't expect, when you get the report, all of that and more is in it. So I'm happy to answer questions, but there's a lot more information about the people who work in Longmeadow, because that is, I think, probably the primary hidden community. During one of our focus groups, I'll never forget, someone said that Longmeadow, it's almost as if the daytime population, there's just this like flip of, people who are leaving to go to their probably higher paying jobs outside of Longmeadow, and then people who are coming in to work lower wage jobs. And the tricky thing to capture is there are some jobs, itinerant workers predominantly, who may work for contractors who might be based outside of Longmeadow, like landscapers, construction workers, things like that. But they're coming in every day to assist households and businesses with, some of the manual labor, and they're not really, it's very hard to capture those workers as well. So in terms of the student population, we really wanted to look at the Longmeadow Public Schools because they participate in 2 programs. They participate in the School Choice Program and the METCO program. So School Choice Program districts they agree to welcome students from other districts, and students can go, they can kind of do a switcheroo, if you will, with the sending district. They contribute to the tuition of the students to the school that they're going to. And so it's not like a free-for-all. There's usually a slated number of available seats. So I think for Longmeadow for this current year, I believe there's only a couple of grades where they had some seats open, and it's done by lottery. So if you look at the 2022 academic year, there were 38 school choice students. So they're coming from outside of Longmeadow. And so they and their families are really heavily tied into, one of the biggest services you provide, which is your schools. And then there are fewer students that are sent from Longmeadow to go to other schools. And that's pretty consistent over the years, where the 20 years that we have data for. So Longmeadow also participates in the METCO program, where students from Springfield are able to go to participating districts. And I believe there are 4 districts that participate to welcome Springfield students. So in the 2021 academic year, there were 31 METCO students So together, that's about 70 students between those two programs in any given year. And their families who are going to be involved with the school. In terms of other hidden communities, we wanted to understand it was the non-resident users of municipal facilities and services. So we primarily looked at the pools, the adult center, and the library. So for the pools, the Greenwood pool is the only one operating, but until 2021, the Reynolds pool was the pool that non-resident pass holders predominantly used. And so most of those non-resident users came from urbanized communities in the lower Pioneer Valley, such as Agawam, West Springfield, Chicopee, or urbanized communities in North Central Connecticut. So that's who's purchasing those pool passes to come and use the amenity in your community. The adult center membership is open to non-residents, but the non-resident seniors, but there's also the food pantry in the adult center, and that's open to all ages. So staff report, they do have non-seniors that they're interfacing with as well, and helping them, direct them to resources they may need. And those people may or may not be from Longmeadow. The library staff report that non-resident visitors often come from the Forest Park neighborhood of Springfield and Enfield, Connecticut. Lastly, resident hidden communities. Again, as we talked to staff primarily, it became clear that there are also resident communities that may fly under the radar, at risk of maybe not participating as much in municipal events and communication. So the one that we heard loud and clear, interview participants repeatedly identified vulnerable seniors living alone as a population in need of direct, consistent, compassionate communication. So these single adults on fixed incomes may have health and safety needs, and they're at risk of becoming isolated, especially when homebound. So that's, I would say, far and wide the population we heard the most about as a kind of a hidden community among your residents. Another one that, to be fair, there was a question earlier about where there might be light on data. And as I, wrapped up the analysis, I would say this bullet right here is where I feel light on data. And, as we finalize the next, the final version of the documents, I may want to revisit this a little bit because Longmeadow's group quarters populations, you have two predominant types in your community. Group quarters are just people who don't live in households and housing units. They live in, maybe a congregate setting, maybe not, but your leading group quarters facilities are your assisted living communities and then students living in the Bay Path University dorms. So they have very different needs. And yet they might both be overlooked in municipal communications. They are technically considered residents of your community. Those students in the dorms, they are reported in Longmeadow for purposes of the census. And that's a group that we don't know much about. The needs of Longmeadow's low-income families with children. I think this was really profound to me because in all of the interviews we conducted, most people really did not identify this as a need. In fact, we sometimes heard, that's really just not an issue in Longmeadow, but nearly 12% of the students enrolled in the Longmeadow public schools are considered low income, and that has a very technical definition. They're not self-identifying as low income. The Department of Education defines it as families that are eligible for, various federal subsidies like free or reduced price lunch, things like that. And those METCO students and school choice students, counting a total of about 70, that is not coming close to accounting for that 12%. So you have other, resident households who are considered low income. And then the very fact that families in need rarely came up as a population of concern likely means that truly is a hidden community within an affluent suburb. So those are the resident hidden communities. And I think I have some discussion questions, a couple, but also this would be a good opportunity if you have questions. And I almost kind of want to take this out of order now that I'm looking at these, which, so question number 2, we identify in the report other hidden communities that should be explored further, such as those itinerant workers who might be working for a company based outside of Longmeadow, but coming to work in Longmeadow. They're very hard to count. Those experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and then immigrant and LEP populations. I would love to hear from you. Do you think there are other hidden communities that this report overlooked, should explore further? So that's a question, you know, and it's okay if you can't answer tonight, but something would be great to have your input on as you review the drafts.
Chris, did you have something?
Well, I think definitely that's something that we're looking into as a group. We just had Long Meadow Days and we got a little bit of feedback from the people. It's too early to try and get enough of it to, you know, I do believe we probably have a lot more of the hidden communities than we're seeing. But trying to get the information of how they're doing, you know, or what I'm seeing, the biggest part of our job is trying to get that talk started. And,
Mhm.
you know, we're out there, we're trying to communicate, and it's just not, it's not as easy, and we haven't had a ton of time to get it. So with time, we're gonna be doing better. We just got a scanner QR code to try and take a survey of, you know, life in town and stuff like that. So this type of information is great. And being able to, you know, be in here with you guys, you know, getting it is wonderful too. But I have no doubt that there are more than what we're seeing right here for sure.
Chris, it sounds like there might be some overlap with some of the work that we've done already on this committee. I don't know if.
I have not been privy to a lot of it,
Okay.
but I'm very interested. This is a tough month to try and do anything really, but I'm very interested in a lot of the stuff that is talked about here, because it does correlate to a lot of the social dynamics that we're getting involved in. But that's it for now.
Alexis, I wanted to go back, when you talked about the schools that you looked at, you indicated that you looked primarily at Long Meadow Public Schools, but we do have several private schools in town, many of which I think have some folks that the municipality might be trying to reach. So I don't know if you had a plan to get in touch with any of the private schools in town.
Yes, so that's a great question. We gave an overview of those in the report, including the LYA Academy, St. Mary's Academy, Willie Ross School for the Deaf. If there are others, but yes, that we're missing, certainly please point it out to us. But we did give some background of those, especially for the Jewish Day School. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting about that school in particular, the regional draw there, the director was sharing that, you know, they have students coming from Vermont, Vermont, and then down into Connecticut. So just that range really is drawing people to Long Meadow as a cultural resource. So yes, thank you for pointing that out. We do talk about that a bit more in the report, but I just, for purposes of tonight, I already went way over what I was planning on. So thank you. And then if there's any other info, any schools that we left out, please let us know.
So a couple come to mind. There's the Long Meadow Montessori. There's some
There's
larger
preschools.
preschools in town. There's the Long Meadow Montessori. And then I think the Jewish Community Center is technically in Springfield, but it's on the edge. It draws a large number of Long Meadow families and is a great resource for the community.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
No, not at the moment. I know there's potentially another preschool opening, and then there's also another school for students with special needs that's in progress.
Okay.
So those would be
Oh.
included eventually down the line too. I don't have names for either of those at the moment,
Okay.
but I could get them.
Okay, and then I think my other big question I'd love to hear from you, whether you want to share tonight or think about it as you read the draft, is when we start to think about, you know, later in the process, recommendations that the plan can address. Given this information, what steps do you think the town could take to better reach some of these hidden communities. And there's a lot that the town has already done a great job with. First of all, even just wanting to bring this report into part of the scope, which I've not seen in any community that I've worked in. And I think it's really an awesome first step.
I just want to point out that Toss raised his hand kind of right before you switched gears, so
Oh,
he might have
sure.
he might have something for that question number 2.
Thanks, Corinne.
Sure.
Okay. I'm on. So I first have a question and 2 comments, if I may. First question is the data regarding employment and income data. Was that related? Do we know whether these were full-time jobs that are being reported, or was this cumulative income data? My 2 comments are, firstly, I'm glad you included the so-called itinerant or migrant community that's here. These folks are completely off the grid for most of us. They're unknown. We don't see them, and they don't have toileting facilities where they work. It's a very important community for us to focus on, in my view, for those reasons and other reasons as well. They are undoubtedly at the lowest possible end of income and require, I think, at least our attention and a response to their needs. And then finally, there are other communities. I totally agree with the speaker. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell who it was, but whoever said that is, I think, completely correct. And one important community, if we look at this in a functional manner, is the community of chemical dependency, whether it be alcohol or other chemicals. And what's interesting is that to our firefighters, EMTs, and police, many of these people are actually very well known. We know they're known. People who are getting fentanyl regularly are known, and there are others as well. And I think that one area where I do think we lag, and hopefully we'll be improving through different mechanisms, through different routes going forward, is identifying folks providing services and offering services, and most importantly, being able to be there when they are in the greatest need, at times when they might be in significant crisis. So I think that's another important group. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Just to answer your question about, whether these are full-time jobs and things like that, it's really tricky because, and I try to detail this a bit in the report, the different data sources we have available to us all have slightly different methodologies. And as much as possible, we tried to do apples to apples. So for example, for anything that came from the Census Bureau's On the Map, I believe we isolated it to primary jobs versus secondary jobs. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the primary jobs are full-time, but it's more likely if someone's identifying something as their primary job versus a secondary job. And one thing that I noticed, I didn't put this in the slides tonight, but those who work in Long Meadow are much more likely to have a first and secondary job, meaning they're working multiple jobs, compared to those who live in Long Meadow, who are more likely to just need their primary job. So it's hard to answer that. I'm not sure for all of the data, if it's just looking at full-time work or not. I'd have to explore further, but that is an excellent question.
I would just like to make a clarifying points too, that in the scope that we asked Barrett Planning Group to fill out for this Hidden Communities report, it was for communities that I, as the town planner, was not easily able to count using traditional census data, which is what I'm trained to do. So Alexis used a lot of census data and American Community Survey data in the report, but she also pulled in other specialized data sources that I'm either not as trained in or, don't know where to look. So, one thing Toss made me think of this when he brought up those with substance use problems. One thing that we didn't hear about today is, for example, vulnerable populations who maybe have, COPD or asthma, or may be prone to heart disease or heart issues, and climate change is just going to make their symptoms worse or stress their health more. And it's not that they're not necessarily a quote unquote hidden community, which is a phrase that we made up just because we didn't know what else to call the communities. They're not hidden, obviously, to themselves or to their own immediate communities, but it's sort of hidden from municipal services, so to speak. And that's because I know how to get public health data to do that. So Alexis's report is not meant to cover literally every single population that can be broken down in Longmeadow, but more as you initially pointed out, Alexis, those who may be accessing goods and services in Longmeadow, who and or working in Longmeadow, who are not counted as part of our census data when we look up our town in the census. So that, not to say that they're not worth counting, but that might explain some of the limitations too that are in this particular section of the report.
So Alexis, what are your next steps with the hidden communities piece that you're working on?
Great question. So with the comments that we got from staff internally, I know we're still working together to make those edits for the public version. And then in terms of recommendations that tie to this section, we haven't really nailed down whether there will be hidden community specific recommendations, or the way I kind of see it is a lot of these recommendations are likely to tie into chapters of the master plan. So for example, when you're looking at the people working in Longmeadow, a lot of the kind of recommendations that have come to my mind would tie into your economic development chapter. And so I think the way it's most likely going to pan out, unless we really have some recommendations that don't fit anywhere, is that recommendations that tie into this report are going to be, really tied to other chapters. So I mean, it really is going to follow the timeline that Lauren outlined with, the setting the vision and goals, and then recommendations, the implementation portion. It will follow along with those. So the revised draft based on staff comments will be released at the same time, and it's from here on in pretty much just following that same timeline.
Are you planning on doing a bit more of a deeper dive into the quarter living that you described, those folks in assisted living or that live at Bay Path and the dorms? Or I know that you said that you identified 12% of students and families that are low income. Are you planning on jumping in a little bit further to that, or do you feel like you have sufficient information?
Yeah, so I think for especially for the schools, we did talk to a few different staff members, and it's almost like the more every step you take, every person you talk to, you want to talk to someone else, and it just you could go on forever. And so there are certain things that I do want to do a deeper dive in based on the comments we get, or even independent of the comments, such as university relations with the town. I know that's an area that I want to look at more for the hidden communities. But other things where we feel other things may end up just being tied in as a recommendation for further exploration. I also think with the business community, I again, depending on comments, depending on what we can do within our scope, I do want to get a little more kind of qualitative information about the populations working in specific businesses.
Any other questions or comments for Alexis? No? Okay. All right. Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I have